let's dive in first of all with GRU 29155. Tell us a little bit about this, Rudy.
Yeah, I forget what the G is, but Russian military intelligence for think about they're the equivalent of US Cybercom, right? Or in Israel they have a particular unit that's the equivalent, right? Begins with A. So they are different in regards to other branches within the Russian government. You got to think about like their scope and then like who mans that particular unit. The 2155 or 29155, they usually their targets are going to be counterintelligence, other equivalent agencies, but for the Western world. So if it's Russia, the United States, anybody in the EU, right? Anybody they perceive as a threat, their targets are their equivalent of the DoD infrastructure. Where you have other units like even the FSB, who might be all inclusive like CIA equivalent, and they have their own embedded cyber team. Their mission sets are different, and then you can kind of attribute who sits in those seats. And what I'm getting at is like there's a lot of freelancers, civilian hacker force within Russia, right? And they're constantly fed. The West is trying to, West is the enemy, right? They're trying to pinch us out. They're trying to invade. They're trying to take our land, whether it's NATO, US, whatever it is, right? So you have like these young bloods, if you will, that are technically savvy, and then they get on these forums and they provide these militias. And then they're the ones that we hear about, cyber syndicates, gangs.
They're on like FBI wanted lists with like
Yeah.
there's rewards out there of like $10 million, and there's like you can go to the web and you can find, and I'll link all the resources. So make sure if you're listening or if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you check the description because I'll have all of the sources down in there. But they've got a list of specific names, their faces. This is who you're
Yeah.
looking for. It's pretty crazy, and I think, were you referring to with Israel with the 8200 unit? Is that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
8200. So think of it as somewhat equivalent. Although I had a scale, I tip it in Israel's flavor. But the GRU in specific, when I mentioned like that civilian kind of hacker group, they're kind of wild, right? Like they're just out there, and then every once in a while, the Russian government point them in a direction when they need something accomplished, or to say they can wash their hands and non-attribution, even though it's Russian based. So the ones that task out that civilian force, right, as a secondary, is GRU. It's not FSB, and then there's a equivalent for I call them the IRS of Russia, but FSB will dip into like propaganda, right? Think 2016 US presidential campaign where fake accounts, social media, that type of hacking, right, associated with that. For GRU is more specific of trade secrets, especially like DoD government contractors. Their whole idea is stealth. They're not loud. And then you have like the civilian component, right, of these hackers, and but you can use them for certain things, but they're wild, unruly, right? Not as disciplined. Where GRU is very disciplined, right?
I
Because
see.
you got to
I
think
see.
about who their targets are, right? They're trying to stay under the wire as long as possible to exfil, right? They're not trying to do ransomware. They're not trying to maybe they want to execute a kill switch, right? But really what they're trying to do is exfil data, intel that belongs to an enemy's government agency, right? And so their whole thing is calculated, precise. It's like the silent professional, if you will.
So why now? Why is this important to be thinking about this like right now? What's
Well, in
going on?
particular, that
Yeah.
the FBI was able to identify those individuals. I forget the number. How many was it?
It
Eight
was,
or
well, I
six?
think it was six. So and I'll have that article in there, but let's see. I've got six.
Yeah, six, right? But to be able to one, it's a silent hey, like you're on notice. We know who you are. And I'd argue that we can play conspiracy theory, but like the federal government, FBI included, probably has names of others, right? And then they're not releasing. The guys that they did put on blast that they essentially, doxed is going to be lower to mid tier, right? But it's a show of we see you, right? And not only that, we can attribute your name.
Mhm.
Here's a picture of you. All right. So it's strategically, it's the equivalent of US cyber forces to include FBI, CIA, NSA, especially, saying, hey, look, we can execute, we can dox you, right?
Yeah.
We are watching, we know who you are. Here's a taste, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And
So
for anybody who's listening or watching that doesn't understand what doxing is, it's basically putting out there in public everything that they have about you to help find you, or
yeah,
to help others identify who you are. Doxing
yeah,
can be a positive thing in an instance where, threat actors are being identified now, and they're out in the public eye, that, they've people know who they are. But it can also be a negative thing when, there's different contexts for how doxing can affect somebody's life. But we're talking about from the instance of exposing that information to really show who the people behind the masks are in this
exactly.
particular
Especially
instance.
those that are wearing the mask pride themselves on being a mask, or like they pride themselves on being on those shadows, those bumps in the wire. And then what the FBI just did is the equivalent of showing a flashlight and like, and then everybody else took a gasp and like, oh, well, I didn't realize somebody was in the corner. So
I have a
yeah,
story from um I have a friend, a very dear friend of ours, who worked in the CIA when Aldrich Ames was in the CIA.
really?
And she told me that and she's elderly lady now. She was in the CIA, many years ago. She told me that he was the kind of person that was in the room and people wouldn't even realize he was there. Like, he was just kind of like off by himself, and ingesting all of this information, selling information, and coming into these meetings, and it was a sponge. Um, so when you said that, it just kind of like sparked that story in my head. It's like, oh yeah, it's like you got to shine the light, because as soon as the spotlight's on you, the jig is up, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you gotta, now you gotta do something. Now you gotta hide, or whatever. So I found an article online. It says UK and allies uncover Russian military unit carrying out cyber attacks and digital sabotage for the first time. And they were identifying cyber activity that went back to at least 2020. This was published the 5th of September. So this is probably about the same time that this information was dropping. But when you've got groups like this, how far back could this group have gone? Do we even have any idea? Do you know?
Uh, Most definitely you have an idea. I'll give you like history, right? 2008, right?
Oh,
Depending on who's listening, right? 2008 was, some of us might recall when Russia invaded Georgia, right? Russia invades Georgia. It only lasted a couple weeks. And so it was the equivalent of like, uh, about what I think it was, read about 3/6 or 3/7 of their mechanized army actually invaded Russia. They essentially just rolled in there, right? It's Russia is a former Soviet Union
yep.
um, country, and so why is it important and why I'm bringing it up? Because within a couple of days, you had a lot of backlash and chatter on dark, RPC channels. So think about dark web, the back end where using Tor, actual like chat channels, right? So if you're watching some old movie and they have like the black desktop and then you have green letters and then you're chatting with somebody, hacker mode, if you will. So some of these older channels were ablaze, these forums and what have you. And these forums were mostly populated by Eastern European citizens, right? Talking about Estonia, Georgia, Latvia, parts of Ukraine at the time, Poland, all former Soviet Union entities, right? And so you had citizens all over there. So if you back up even before 2008, Soviet Union falls, the Western world didn't do a very good job of making sure that Russia was ushered into, you know, par with the rest of Western Europe and Western civilization, right? So what you had is all these pockets of young people, in particular men, right? You know, we know, like, being young as a young man and then idle, we don't have a lot of purpose, opportunity. You start to, you know, hang around the wrong crowd, right? It just so happens everybody, the crowd is in the same spot. But what they did have is a lot of old tech, right? Late 80s, early 90s tech, as the rest of the world is going forward. So some of the world's best hackers came from these parts of the world because of that situation. So then when you fast forward to 2008, who's on these chatter boxes, if you will, as news is breaking, Russia's invading Georgia, you have all these people that are either the world's greatest hackers at that time or about to be. They're only a couple of years away, right? So they're very talented at what they do. So what they did is they launched a campaign. Think about Anonymous. They got different handles, but they all have like this commonality where they don't. Russia is like this big thing that it's all like the Imperial forces of Star Wars, right? So they want to gang up. So what they do is they start to DDoS, the equivalent of Russia's DoD servers, right? So they actually go black for a couple hours. You know, one news syndication might say for X amount of hours and then some government agency might elaborate on exactly how much. The key is that they went dark. Who went dark? The mechanized forces that actually invaded Georgia, right? So even if it was for like 5 minutes, you got to realize the impact. If you're some commander,
You're attacker, you're just like,
and you have
fire
no,
it now, and then
but
boom, they're out.
But if you're some like you know, general, brigadier, commander, colonel, and you have a bunch of tanks, mechanized force, your boots on ground, you're in enemy territory, but you can't phone back home to Moscow, right? Because it's hang up. You know, you're just getting a fax tone, if you will. It is some serious implications from that, and even if it's for just 5-10 minutes, let alone hours or days, right? Because you don't know if World War III just happened. So that was a big thing. But lessons learned, task to the GRU was figure out everybody involved. Keep in mind, it's in the dark web. So they already had their forces kind of listening in, but they didn't realize the gravity of employing vigilantes, right? Then how to sway them to do certain things. It just so happens everybody was swayed to label Russia as their oppressor. But Russia said, all right, how do we capitalize on this? First things first, let's go figure out who is involved and then punish them, right? So imagine there's a dedicated team within the Russian government that's going out and find all these hackers. Then they identify them and then they extort them. You come work for us or else, and then fill in the blank, right? And then what did they work on? They worked on building the back channels, non-attributable, but I still have my tentacles into you, right? So you can't trace it back to Russia, but you can in a loose way. But now I have this vigilante force that I've extorted and might have first been my enemy. And then they start collecting these syndicates and they use some of the best 0 days ever because that's what they've been doing from the end of 2008 all the way to what year? 2014. So in 2014, what happens? Russia invades Ukraine. Every worker bee that works OT and IT, right? IT, information tech. OT is just operational tech. It's mostly relative to SCADA type systems, right? Think about nuclear power plants, coal burning facilities, water treatment plants. Usually,
SCADA is the basically we basically just kind of refer to that as IoT now. I think a lot of that,
yeah,
but SCADA is all those little devices, PLCs, programmable logic controllers, and all of that. Supervisory control and data administration, is that what it stands for? And data acquisition? It's something like that. But basically it's all the little relays and everything that controls water flow in and out of a
Yeah.
nuclear power plant, or might control, wind turbines, in a, wind farm. That's where I first heard of SCADA, but yeah.
No, yeah, you're right on, right? And then really you'll see OT, operational technology, and then IT. Everything related to SCADA, everything that you just listed. Think about who uses it. It's their protocols, computer parts, if you will,
Yeah.
languages that were built by
They have
engineers.
operating systems. They have traffic in and
But it's
out.
built by, well, for what purpose? It's built by people that are really engineers. They're trying to get this gizmo to work, an
That's right.
actuator or a valve to work. That they're not conscientious of really
Security. Bolt-on
security
security actor. That's
or the internet, right? Like it's
yeah.
not that's not a thing for them. So OT is just all the tech and the trons that are associated with like engineers, right? If you got to turn a valve and it's a digital thing, that's OT. But normally, like in a power plant, you have OT, large part, but you have IT that makes sure that everything's interconnected, and then they are always on when you have the engineers driving the OT, right? So you actually have two divisions, even though they have T technology, they're not the same thing. Well, if you were to interview the people that actually man those stations for OT and IT within those system utility systems, right? Nuclear power plants, water treatment facilities, dams, things of that nature, even like streetlights. They'll tell you 2 weeks before forces landed in Crimea, right? Where they Russian, but they weren't Russian because they didn't have a patch. They took it in the face. They saw some tactics never seen in the wild. Keep in mind, they're not security centric. They had some idea and the importance of OPSEC and then situational awareness. But some of these things, traditional tools, didn't catch these new, what we call 0 days, right? Never seen before out in the wild. That was in 2014, right? But who crafted it? Those that they chased down in 2008, and they built up this army, and they used this as a not preemptive, but like it's kind of like laying bombs on the ground, blowing up every radar for that, so that tanks and troops can actually go and do what they got to do. What you did is you disrupted the enemy with trons, with ones and zeros, right? And so who's directing that? GRU. And so it's lessons learned, even when they invaded Ukraine, right? Recent 2022. For 6 weeks beforehand, you'll see documentaries on those same people that are working IT, OT, and utility companies. But now it also extended itself to municipalities, to financial districts, right? Where they were bombarded by incoming of these tactics, these 0 days of infrastructure going dark. If you back up to 2014, all those parts that made that work, so that way this government-backed entity can execute XYZ. Everybody that worked on it, they still had a leg into this dark cyber syndicate world, right? They were being extorted, and they did in the name of country, whatever capacity, it was still backed by a government, right? But those artifacts that made everything work, those 0 days, we actually know. Most people don't realize that's where they stem from. But Spectre, Meltdown, all these are the artifacts of that first wave 2 weeks before Russians put boots on ground in Crimea. And most people don't realize it was repackaged and weaponized to now do ransomware. The same people who developed it that were extorted by the GRU, they're still in the dark web. And then they create these own cyber syndicates, and they either sold it to other gangs or they used it to retrieve funds. Either way, they monetized it.
Yeah.
So that's why it's important. That's why you should know who the GRU is. That's why you should know those faces, because that's the storyline that it transpires to. What we did was we just went from 2008 all the way to 2024, right? And so those faces on there, like I don't know, they're all young, right? They're all
They are. Yeah.
really young. And then but 10 years from now, you can imagine they'd all be the heads of state for some cyber syndicate, some underground gang out in the future. That makes sense? So they're
Yeah.
not on this list now for GRU, but I imagine if not found and prosecuted, then they'll be on some other list for some weird gang
So
future.
yeah, so there's one thing I heard kind of in there, well, a couple things I heard in that all of that information, that history lesson that we just got, Rudy. Thank you for that, because I mean, it's like I'm trying to put these pieces together, but laying it out like this is a timeline. Um, Access to that old tech ended up being an asset for them, gave them a lot of skill and ability to just uh, help them develop their talents. Um, these guys get recruited, but it's different than just like some recruiting of some hacker group that they just spin off on their own and say, go disrupt stuff. These
Yeah,
guys are probably saying, all right, this is what you're going to disrupt. This is the goal. You're going to do this, or you're going to take this out. And it's very specific, very targeted, probably quite regional. This is part of our game plan for an attack, an invasion, whatever. We're gonna play this out. We're gonna play this pro. And this has got to be clockwork when this happens. Because to pull off a coordinated attack to make things go dark isn't just like, oh, somebody just hacked somebody's old, Windows 95 box and boom, it was game over. No, that,
yeah.
I mean, I'm sure that was like multiple spears going in there at the same time, a lot of testing in advance to make all of that happen.
Yeah, it's almost like herding squirrels, right? Like because if you think about it, you have all these players, they are tech, they want to make a name for themselves, they got their own motivations. But the role that 29155 plays is leveraging that mob for the needs of the government, of the Russian government, right? And then so it's like you can go ahead and beat the Wild Wild West, but when we call on you and we need you to do something, you're gonna do it our way, kind of thing. And then it's not, oh well, I won't partake. No, you will, right? And then in the last couple of years, really, say since about 2020, before if it was extortion, now it's very much they've convinced this younger population that it's for the love of country, and it's semi like they're tapping into their patriotic roots, right? Their nationalism. And so I have seen that, different from 2008, 2014, and then 2022 is where the world's greatest hackers, if you will, it's almost like reluctantly they did it, and in order to do it, they had to have their arms twisted, right? Their identities revealed and things like that. Where now this younger generation, they are more of the product of they were swindled, right? They're injected this nationalism into them, so they're like, we're in the wild wild west, but my country needs me. I'll go ahead and do it because
On
the
top of
Western world is trying
extortion.
to, right? Yeah. So
Hmm.
gotta convince people it's their own idea, and I think the governments realize that. So
Oh yeah, wow, that's a dangerous approach.